Welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be here with you. We got a little bit different setting this week. Usually we have the show at 7 to 8 p.m. on Saturday nights in my study at home, live on the internet. But this week we're going to pre-record it because we're here at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington, D.C., where the Future of Freedom Foundation has a booth here in the exhibit hall. We're participating in a panel discussion tomorrow on why the Patriot Act should be repealed. I feel like sort of we're a libertarian antibody in a sea of conservative infections, you know. But, you know, it's kind of exciting to be here as sort of the antidote to conservatism. And I thought, well, you know, this would be a nice opportunity to explore the philosophy of conservatism, especially compared to libertarianism. We decided to make specifically the topic of the show, you know, why is it that conservatives support statism? And I recall an essay that Friedrich Hayek once wrote, and Hayek, of course, is the libertarian Nobel Prize-winning economist, who conservatives, by the way, love to cite. But he wrote an essay once called "Why I Am Not a Conservative," and explaining to people what are the philosophical problems, the pragmatic problems with conservatism, and why Hayek, was a libertarian. So that's what we're going to do today, and I got a special surprise for you. I got a special guest for the first time in the history of the show, since we've been doing this for quite a few months now, and that's James Bovard. And many of you that have been supporters of the Future of Freedom Foundation, you know Jim. He's been writing for our publication, Freedom Daily, gosh, I think probably since 1994. He's one of my real heroes in life, one of the most courageous, principled guys in terms of libertarian principles and pointing out the faults and failures and wrongdoing of government that I've ever seen, and editor of several books. So I asked Jim, I said, why don't you come on over and we'll do some freewheeling, a little bantering back and forth. He's going to be with me on the panel tomorrow about why the Patriot Act should be repealed. By the way, that's sponsored by the Campaign for Liberty. And then we got a few audience members. Maybe we'll throw some questions up. But anyway, Jim, it's nice to be here with you. And so tell me what you think. What's the problem with conservatives?
Well, first of all, I have to point out it's hard to find good guests these days. And it came down to a choice of me or Newt Gingrich. And Newt was busy. So, but thanks for your kind words. What's the problem with conservatism? I mean, well, that's you know, this is only 45 minutes, right? You know, it's interesting. There are some conservatives who really care about freedom, and some who have recognized in the final years of the Bush administration that even having a president who called himself conservative was not enough. That simply because a person used certain phrases or praised the Constitution did not mean he could be trusted with absolute power. And yet, there were so many lockstep conservatives. There was a moment in Bush's presidency, it was a few weeks after the New York Times had exposed the fact that the National Security Agency had done warrantless wiretaps on thousands of Americans. And it was just a total travesty of the Fourth Amendment that prohibits unreasonable searches. It was a prohibition of a travesty of federal law. And what Bush did, he made a State of the Union address a few weeks later. And Bush stood there and he bragged about his terrorist surveillance program, which he had had the courage to impose. And almost all of the Republicans gave him a standing ovation. And if there was any doubt about the absolute hollowness of most of the Republicans in Washington, that should have settled it, because these folks had put their, you know, these were folks who would stand up and cheer the total destruction of the Bill of Rights. I think some people in the subsequent years have learned that that's a bad idea. I don't know how many. It's also hard to tell how many of the rank and file Republicans at this convention care about individual liberty, as opposed to the freedom to start wars to spread democracy.
Well, the thing that I saw about 9/11, and I think 9/11 was a real demarcation point as far as libertarians and conservatives are concerned, and because it was seen to me that this is what really exposed conservatives in terms of their willingness to trade liberty for security. I mean, they were willing to trash all their mantras about, you know, small government and low government spending and everything
when
9/11 hit.
Yeah, and it was, and it wasn't like that they anguished over it. It was like, you know, the Twin Towers crashed that morning. By evening, you know, they were all set. I mean, George Bush, in his speech that night on 9/11, he said that those people had attacked America because they hated freedom. And I was curious, how is it possible to know what the motive was when we didn't even know who the attackers were? But that was the paradigm that the Bush administration set up on the same day as the attacks. And they stuck with that. And they were able to persuade masses of Americans that anything the U.S. government did that was anti-terrorist was automatically pro-freedom, because it was the terrorists who were the real enemies of freedom. And this is the same kind of claptrap we've heard before, because for a long, we've heard in the last recent years, there have been some conservatives who've tried to say that the only enemy of freedom is the liberals. And as long as the liberals are out of power, then freedom is safe. And it's always sad to see anybody fall for that kind of garbage, especially given the history of both political parties and politicians across the board, not all of them, but most of them, being utter weasels and not hesitating to stab Americans' rights and liberties in the back.
Well, you know, my beef has always been with conservatives is that they've got beautiful mantras. I mean, they've got the standard libertarian mantras. Free enterprise, private property, and limited government. I mean, that's their favorite one. You can find it in their speeches and on their stationery and on their websites. And small government's better, and so forth. But yet, when the rubber meets the road and you get into the actual programs, I just don't see any difference between a liberal and a conservative. On the welfare state, you've got Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public schooling, farm subsidies, foreign aid. On the drug war, you got them favoring the drug war. Foreign policy, they favor all this foreign aid. Civil liberties, they're horrible. I mean, my beef has always been, I can't see on the pragmatic side, what's the difference between a liberal and a conservative?
You know, it's interesting. One mantra I've been hearing at this conference, this conservative conference, is that I guess Michelle Bachmann gave her speech yesterday, a possible presidential candidate, and she was stressing that she supports all three of the the three pillars of the conservatism now, which is national security, social values, and fiscal prudence, or something like that. And I'm kind of thinking, what about individual liberty? Did we forget that one, or has that been just completely thrown over the board? Now, I mean, a simple issue in this individual liberty, I mean, these illegal wiretaps the government's been doing, this isn't a gray area. We know that the National Security Agency has wiretapped thousands of Americans without a warrant. We have no idea who's been wiretapped. It's possible that some of the people who are watching this online have been wiretapped. And oh, by the way, just the fact that you've gone to this website and are watching this video, that might increase your odds of being wiretapped in the future. And as far as complaining about it, you know, write a letter to your congressman, and he'll have some intern send you a response.
Well, and what's also fascinating about this whole situation is what's happening in Egypt, because they have their own anti-terrorism law that came into existence after Sadat was assassinated, Mubarak came into power, and it was done as an emergency, a temporary measure. And I just can't help but smile when I think about the measures that this tyrannical regime has implemented for the past 30 years: indefinite detention, torture, arbitrary arrests, national security courts, and they justify it all with terrorism and the drug war. Now, does that not sound familiar when we talk about the same things over here?
Well, yes, it sounds very familiar. There was Colin Powell made a comment after 9/11 that he said the 9/11 attacks, I think, gave the U.S. more appreciation or more understanding of the Egyptian anti-terrorism policies. And the anti-terrorism policies there were basically to crush any possible dissent in anybody who stepped out of line or anybody who spoke up. And that was, you know, the torture in Egypt has been bankrolled for many years by the U.S. taxpayers. And I hope we can find out from assuming that there's a takeover of the government there by a new crew, I hope they'll open up the files and we can find out what American officials knew and when they knew it about the torture in Egypt. Because there are a lot of top U.S. government officials, perhaps even some presidents, who knew what was being done with our money and perhaps even in our name. And yet, you know, I'm not holding my breath on that one. So.
Well, they were doing it in partnership. I mean, the whole rendition torture program with the CIA, I mean, their partner was this guy who was vice president. I don't know what he's going to be now, Suleiman. He was in charge of the domestic CIA. He was the guy coordinating things with the CIA to torture on their behalf. I mean, this is another example of the hypocrisy and duplicity of both the liberals and the conservatives. Here they have been for 30 years supporting this brutal dictatorship. And it's not the first time. I mean, you've got the Shah of Iran, Pinochet in Argentina, and Chile. I mean, you've got all the Latin American dictators. You got a whole host. Saddam Hussein, they supported him. You see, they don't see anything wrong with this. This is what is so amazing to me, that conservatives ostensibly stand for moral principles. I mean, they preach moral principles, yet they see absolutely nothing wrong with having sent billions and billions of dollars of foreign aid to these Egyptian tyrants that have used this money to oppress and tyrannize people to such an extent that they're now out in the streets risking their lives in demonstration against this regime. How can a conservative possibly reconcile that kind of thing with their principles of moral principles, family values, free enterprise, private property, limited government?
Well, that's a good question, but it's kind of a false assumption that they have to reconcile things. And for politics, people involved in politics, they have so many contradictions, and often they simply don't give a damn about them. I mean, a person can be in favor of A and in favor of the opposite of A, and as long as they get votes and contributions for both positions, it's fine. Logic and politics doesn't mix very well. It's like water and oil.
That's a fascinating point, because I think that's the primary reason why conservatives are so uncomfortable with libertarians. Because if libertarians didn't exist, then conservatives could continue playing this game of, oh, well, it's left versus right, you know, you pick us over the liberals. Along come the libertarians and say, hey, this is all a charade. This is a game. There ain't a dime's worth of difference between you two, and all you're doing is vying for power of who's going to get the largesse, who's going to get the nice little perks. Libertarians come along with a consistent set of principles that conservatives enunciate but can't live up to, and so we remind conservatives of what they should have been and what they still should be, as far as I'm concerned.
You might be right. I don't know if most conservatives are that perceptive. and I'm serious on that. I'm not making a joke. I mean, you know, you're kind of assuming that people are paying attention and adding up the bits and pieces, but I think nowadays a lot of the rank and file conservatives, it's simply a series of phrases. I mean, it's just, there's this phrase that they get from Sean Hannity, this one that they get from Rush Limbaugh, maybe one or two from Glenn Beck, and that is their worldview and their whole philosophy. And it doesn't matter if it harmonizes with the world, it harmonizes with what they listen to on talk radio or talk shows TV. And there's not any learning curve because they don't give a damn about the facts. So,
well, and I think that's why they try to exclude libertarians, is we create what Ludwig von Mises called felt uneasiness in them. I mean, you know, we'll talk about free enterprise, private property, and limited government, and say, therefore, we need to repeal the entire welfare state programs, the whole Roosevelt revolution, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, public schooling. We'll advocate a free market system in charity, in education, in the economy. We respect the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. We'd repeal the Patriot Act.
Don't forget the 2nd Amendment.
Well,
I'm joking.
You see, that's the thing that they'll say. Well, we love the Bill of Rights, but they're only talking about the 2nd Amendment.
That's right. And
the rest of it, don't forget.
Well, and you have prominent conservatives like Ann Coulter, Newt Gingrich, who are just trashing the First Amendment. I mean, both of them have said things that are just like, I would think would disqualify one from being respected at all in public discourse, but no, they say that and they still get $30,000 a speech, same as you.
Exactly. Well, you were the one that wrote about the free enterprise zones under the Bush administration.
I think of the free speech zones.
Free speech zones.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
yes. That was so brazen. I mean, it was, and you had all these people going along with the idea that if Bush was coming to a city, that the Secret Service could come in and set up a pen. Sometimes it's actually a fenced-in pen, like a half a mile or a mile away from the motorcade or where Bush would be speaking, and that was where people could go and hold up their anti-Bush signs, because it was very important that the president not see any signs to criticize him, because otherwise he would not be able to be a good leader. I think that was the rationale, maybe not.
Well, you know, I think part of the problem too is that I think conservatives live a life of the lie to a large extent, that they've convinced themselves that this really is a free society. You see, you know, thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free. And then by virtue of convincing themselves that this oppressive state, the NSA, CIA, DEA, welfare system, Homeland Security is freedom, along come us libertarians and say, hey, let's get rid of all this. That confuses them. They say, wait a minute, how come you want to get rid of freedom?
Well, I mean, it's interesting what people think of as freedom, because I think for a lot of people, freedom means being able to say the Pledge of Allegiance and being able to kick the ass of anyone who doesn't say it. And I'm serious on that. I mean, there's folks I see online and they're like, okay, I hope he took his medicine this week. But there is that very visceral thing. I don't know if it was Hayek or someone else who said that freedom of speech is not that important to most people, because most people would never say anything that the government was worried about or that would threaten the government in the least. But you have a cadre of people in society, not a cadre, but there are individual elements here and there who will speak up and will call out BS when the government's doing something outrageous, or will stand up and say the protest of civil rights violations or civil liberties violations. And those are the people that the government frightens, and if the government can shut them up or intimidate them, then the government's halfway home to a authoritarian situation. And it's fascinating to see how few conservatives cared about the suppression of freedom under George W. Bush. You had these free speech zones, you had the wiretapping, you had a lot of effort to go out and intimidate critics of all stripes, and there was a mindset in the 2004 re-election campaign, almost as if any type of dissent was the moral equivalent of treason. There was that Zell Miller speech from the GOP convention out of New York in 2004. He set a tone of just absolute intolerance and just utter dogmatism, and the GOP delegates loved him. And that symbolized what the GOP had turned into morally.
Well, you mentioned the Pledge of Allegiance. One of the things that amuses me about the Pledge is how conservatives, I don't think they realize that the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist.
Well, that's true. I mean, but it's fascinating. People got in the habit of saying that. And there was, it's fascinating. It was, I guess, in the 1930s or 1940s when when it became common to require school children to recite it every morning. And then you had some, was it Jehovah's Witnesses or some other religious group that said that they wouldn't do it. And all of a sudden you have these kids and their parents being sent to jail. Well, it's a free country. If someone doesn't admit it's free, let's put them in jail. And yet we have that same mindset now. I mean, it happens, it's still happening around places, but it's interesting, this whole Pledge of Allegiance, one thing I don't understand, why is it we have to pledge allegiance to the government when the government admits it's breaking the law and violating the Constitution? Doesn't that make a person who makes that pledge a serf? Isn't that like groveling? I mean, it's like the government has said in public it's going to kick you, and yet you're still going to lick the government's boot by pledging allegiance, no matter how many laws and constitutional amendments it violates? What am I missing?
Well, and then there's that great picture of where the school kids here in the United States are reciting the Pledge of Allegiance with the outstretched arm. And for some reason, after the 30s, that got to be unpopular, and they moved it over here. But look, Jim, it's really interesting to hear what you say, because this is one of the things that attracted me to libertarianism, is that libertarians stand on principle as compared to liberals and conservatives. Now, that's not to say that conservatives are not good on certain issues. Gun control, they're by and large fairly good. Liberals are very good on civil liberties and First Amendment, by and large, like the ACLU. But we take the position that on like free speech, we will defend the right of people to speak the most offensive, abominable things in the world, because we understand that that's what freedom is. Freedom isn't the right to say the responsible thing. It's the right to say the irresponsible thing. And this is what I think statists don't realize sometimes, that that's the essence of freedom. The freedom to do the wrong thing, ingest drugs, or as long as your conduct's peaceful, that you don't go out and murder, rape, and steal somebody, you should be free to live your life any way you want.
Yeah, that's good. I think part of it, as far as statists, I think what we saw a lot during the George W. Bush administration is a lot of conservatives just love authority. I mean, they're very happy when they've got a leader up there and they think he's absolute and omniscient and spreading freedom, and they get very angry at people who say, well, actually he's full of crap. It hits a raw nerve, and I noticed that a few times after 9/11 with some of the articles I did. But it's just, I mean, there's almost a desperation to find a leader who is possible to submit to. And a lot of people who have that mindset get very angry at folks who hold back and say, yeah, I don't think so. Or say, well, actually, last month he said the opposite. Because it's sort of like there's such a visceral reaction. And we've gotten away from that pretty much in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. But especially shortly before the invasion of Iraq and for several years afterwards, there was just a visceral hostility towards any kind of dissent or often any criticism of the president. And it's hard to reconcile people who would be intolerant of any criticisms of the president and still think that those folks care about freedom. What we're seeing now, we've got a lot of conservatives who have made some solid criticism of Obama. Some of them are consistent, but many of those same folks were treating George Bush as if he was God's gift to the American people and should be above criticism and should be without restraint. That was one of the things that was shocking to me. One of my biggest disappointments in the Bush administration was in May of 2004, you had some of those John Yoo memos leak out. John Yoo was one of the top people in the Justice Department, and he had these memos which said that the president was not restrained by the law, by the criminal law, or by the Constitution in wartime. Therefore, the president needed absolute power, and if the president said the U.S. needed to torture people, that meant it was legal. It was the same perverse doctrine that Nixon had and most of the other dictators of the last 200 years. And yet, you had this come out in public. At the same time, you had some of the pictures and the other doctrines from Abu Ghraib. And the rank and file conservatives did not give a damn. You had the president's people claiming absolute power, and Bush was still their symbol of freedom, even though he was claiming absolute power. And I just, there were a lot of intelligent people I knew, and yet they would be able to hold both those positions. And it's kind of like, it shook my idealism.
Well,
it's supposed to be a joke.
I think that conservatives have long looked at the federal government in a paternalistic role, the same way liberals have. That it's our daddy. Our daddy takes care of us. It takes care of our retirement through Social Security, our health care costs. The government handles our children's education. But with many conservatives, I think it goes much further than that. I think they have come to see the federal government, even if subconsciously, as a god. They're very religious. They may go to church on Sunday, but the rest of the week, they're out there essentially worshiping at the altar of the state. And if you dare criticize the state, especially on foreign affairs, or you say anything that isn't 100% praising of the troops, it's heresy.
Yes. Heresy is the right term for it, but I think it's important to understand, a lot of conservatives see the government as a god, and a lot of them might just kind of, once they make that implicit assumption, that just assume that, well, it's like the God, it's omniscient and omnibenevolent. But no, this is a God that's more like some of the gods in the Greek tragedies. It's not very competent, and it's probably going to screw you in the back if it gets a chance. And it loves nothing better than throwing wrenches into people's lives, because that's what the government does real well. But this whole notion that government has some kind of super competence, that was the same BS that the socialists touted for a long time. That was the only way that socialism made any sense, by the assumption that once the government's gets all this power, it's going to make all these wise decisions. They never had a good track record of why people should believe that. It was an article of faith. And it's the same now with the conservatives but I think a lot of liberals may feel that as well now that Obama's president. So I think the liberals don't tend to be as overt in their groveling. In a lot of cases,
but you can see what's happened with the liberal movement. They were so critical of Bush for 8 years with all the civil liberties violations, the invasion of Iraq, and so forth. What has happened to the liberal community since then, since Obama took over? I mean, they've essentially silenced themselves with one big exception, a lot of small exceptions. Glenn Greenwald has been absolutely fantastic. He's a blogger on Salon.com, liberal. I mean, this guy's relentless as far as the defense of civil liberties, but I don't see that many people in the liberal community standing fast for the things that they stood fast for under the Bush administration. And if the Republicans get back in power, we're going to see the same thing they were doing during the 8 years of the Bush administration.
Yeah, I think there are liberals who have been very principled on this. The ACLU is still doing some great lawsuits.
Right.
Center for Constitutional Rights is doing great work. There's a lot of there's a Rutherford Institute down in Charlottesville does great work. And there's a lot of individual liberals I've talked to who are very disappointed by Obama. But as far as your comment about if a Republican gets back in office and it's not Ron Paul, I had hoped there would be a fundamental backlash from Bush among conservatives. The conservatives would have realized that no, it was a mistake to put so much blind faith in a leader. It was a mistake to try to make that leader absolute. It was a mistake to close our eyes when that leader announced that he had a right to violate the Constitution and the federal law, as Bush did on several occasions. But they haven't learned that. Basically, what they want to do is find a better con artist, which is what retail politics amounts to very often. And that's what conservatives are looking for, I guess, here when they're doing their straw poll. They're just trying to figure out who is it who the American people would trust. And a lot of gullible voters out there, so it's hard to know who'd be the most likely to con them. So.
Well, one of the fascinating things I found about Bush as compared to, say, Mubarak, is that when Mubarak got his anti-terrorism law enacted, he at least went to the Egyptian parliament and got it approved. Now,
okay.
We as libertarians would not defend that, but at least he followed a legal process of getting the thing enacted into law. Bush just simply decreed that he had all these powers after 9/11.
Yeah, Bush decreed that he had the power to torture and that he had the power to listen to America's phone calls and to read Americans' emails based on his own fiat, based on his own claim. And he didn't need to go to he didn't need a stinking judge because he was the president. And this is, and the sad thing is, I think back to the late 1970s, there was a movement among conservative lawyers called the Federalist Society. And you had a lot of lawyers who were claiming to be kind of interested in political philosophy and interested in going back to the first principles, the founding principles, and using those to judge government nowadays. The Federalist Society, even before George W. was elected, had really gone downhill. I went to one of their conventions in 1994. I was doing a book then called Lost Rights. And I said to one of their leaders, I said, I'm really disappointed the Federalist Society hasn't said anything about the Fourth Amendment, which protects people's homes and against unreasonable searches and stuff like that. He said, well, that's not true at all. The Federalist Society has been very active in fighting OSHA's inspections of factories without a warrant. And I said, yeah, okay, well that's almost the same as preventing the SWAT team from kicking down my front door. So.
Well, you bring up the SWAT teams. Before 9/11, we all know that the feds were making massive infringements on the Fourth Amendment and, of course, on the Bill of Rights with the drug war. And I think it's something that I'd like to discuss with you on this one, because they're now using all the anti-terrorism stuff. They're trying to expand it to the war on drugs, where I guess they make a drug user an enemy combatant and they whisk him off to some secret prison and torture him or something.
They wouldn't do that, would they?
No, of course not. But Mubarak has done it because he has justified his anti-terrorism law for both drug users, drug dealers, and terrorists. And so, yeah, I think they would do it. But tell me a little bit about the drug war, about conservatives and the drug war, because remember, conservatives talk about free enterprise, private property, free markets, limited government. How do you reconcile conservatism with the war on drugs, which to me is the litmus test of whether a person is a libertarian or not?
I think it'd be easier to ask a conservative that, because it'd probably give you a little more charitable answer. I think a lot of conservatives feel like that people should have freedom, but not to do bad things. And so, since doing drugs is a bad thing, then it's important. Then government kind of protects freedom in the long run if it prevents you from doing drugs. I think William Bennett, when he was drug czar, had a line, something to the effect that it's not possible to have a free society if people were kind of whacked out on drugs. He didn't say anything about having a free society if the politicians are whacked out on power. But that was always a weak point for Bennett. So I don't know. I think it's just, I think that there are a series of trump cards. It was the same in the 1980s. a lot of the conservatives said they were in favor of free speech and free press, except for obscenity and pornography. And so they had this Mies Commission, which I don't know if people recall the Mies Commission, but it was they had these hearings and they went and gathered up a bunch of obscene magazines and made a long, they had a very long appendix listing each film in each magazine and giving a thumbnail summary of what the magazine did or what the film showed. And you know, I hate to think of children getting their hands on that appendix. But even that Mies Commission came out and said that the usual use of that material was for, let's just say it was used in private. But that didn't matter. I mean, the conservative politicians wanted to have a jihad, and so you had this war on pornography, war on obscenity. It's helped a number of Republicans get elected. It's helped federal attorneys raise funds for their congressional campaigns. But it's a total travesty of a free society. But on drugs, you know, there's all the evidence. It doesn't matter if the drug war fails. It makes politicians look like they're protecting us. And it's one more way that politicians can frighten people into submission, because they can push this drug button, or push this terror button, or push this obscenity button, or push this child abuse button. And as long as people stay frightened, they aren't going to ask questions, because a spirit of fear and the spirit of liberty, they're almost contradictory. People who want to have freedom, people who want to maintain their freedom, need to have some calluses. So.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head as far as how conservatives view freedom. Conservatives feel that everyone should be free as long as they do the responsible thing. And so they're only free to do what is responsible. Well, people in China are free by that definition. In North Korea, they're free. The real test of a free society is not whether you're free to do something responsible or moral or right. It's whether you're free to do the irresponsible, the immoral, or the wrong, as long as your conduct is peaceful. So in the idea of obscenity or pornography, libertarians would say, well, keep that legal. We may not condone it, we may not approve it, but that's what freedom is all about, to read, look at whatever people may disapprove of. Same thing with drugs. In fact, Jim, the same thing with respect to charity, that conservatives and liberals take the position that you can be free, but not so much where you might turn your back on your parents. So we got to force you to fund them through Social Security. Or you might not help the poor, so we got to make you, provide your taxes in the welfare state. Libertarians would say people should be free to keep everything they earn, and they decide what to do with it, even if they decide to turn their back on their parents and the poor. But we also believe that a free society nurtures these values of charity, responsibility, and morality, and so forth.
That's a good point. Take a step back. You're talking about the attitude in the drug war. There was a writer in the late 1800s by the name of Lysander Spooner, and he had a great phrase that vices are not crimes. And okay, there's a lot of people I know have got bad habits. It doesn't justify sending the SWAT team in to kick their butt and make them reform. But a lot of conservatives have this attitude that government condones whatever it does not prohibit. Or better yet, government condones whatever it does not punish. And therefore, if marijuana is legal, then that's the same as giving reefer to 10-year-olds. It's a completely absurd assumption, but it's a kind of notion that foments intolerance. And the drug war, in its essence, is intolerance at its worst, because you've got a large group of people who dislike the lifestyles or the assumed lifestyles of a lot of other people. And it doesn't matter that over 80 or 100 million people have done marijuana at some point in their lives. It's important to make it illegal, because otherwise we'll all go to hell.
Well, you can see the destruction that has taken place. I mean, the death and destruction, 30,000 people alone in Mexico in the last 3 or 4 years. In fact, I'm always amused by the conservatives to say, well, we really haven't cracked down in the war on drugs. Well, it's ridiculous. Of course we've cracked down. We've got mandatory minimum sentences, people getting sent sky high for a little minor dope violation. But Mexico is proof positive of what happens when you crack down. And you got all this death and destruction. You can't even go into Mexico anymore as far as tourism is concerned. And yet I don't see conservatives taking individual responsibility for any of this, despite the fact that individual responsibility is one of their most favored mantras.
Well, I mean, anytime I hear a politician praising individual responsibility, I figure I'm about ready to get screwed. Because it means he's going to go for more power. Well, you know, we need to enhance the penalties for this, or we need a new federal criminal law here, or whatever. I mean, it's just, you know, what mystifies me is that people continue to trust politicians. Conservatives were most overt that way in the, you know, after 9/11, though it was across the board. In the first weeks after 9/11, the percentage of Americans who trusted government to do the right thing doubled. And that was one of the greatest tragedies of the post-9/11 world. It was from that increased trust in government that was a Pandora's box. Torture came out of that, the wiretaps came out of that, the war with Iraq came out of that. It was that blind trust. And unfortunately, I'm not really convinced that Americans have recognized that the government is far more venal and dangerous than what a lot of them thought it was after 9/11. And as long as Americans have that blind trust of government, it's going to be very difficult to preserve individual liberty.
Okay, we got about 15 minutes left, and you got any questions coming from the audience? We'd love to you throw me the question, and I'll repeat it for the microphone. Yes, sir.
You make a lot of good points about the inconsistencies within conservatism, but I'm wondering about the inconsistencies within libertarianism, and particularly talking about the future of freedom under Islamic threat to the world. Freedom goes away under every Islamic government. How can libertarians not stand out and say this is a greater threat than communism, National Socialism, Nazis have ever been? Why aren't you standing up against Islamic threats?
Okay, the question is that, okay, while there may be some inconsistencies in conservatism, what about the inconsistencies in libertarianism, in the sense that libertarians don't seem to appreciate the so-called Islamic threat, that if Muslims take control, there won't be any freedom at all? We see this in countries like, you know, Afghanistan or, well, maybe
now?
not Afghanistan, excuse me.
Wait, that's our fault now.
That's
so,
right,
I
that's
mean,
right, sorry. That's
to be
free.
the Taliban.
Afghanistan's free now.
Yeah, that's
Iraq too, that's free now too, right?
That's the 50 million people that the Bush administration added to freedom. He was always saying, we brought freedom to 50 million people. So
Kuwait too, Kuwait's free too, right? Because we freed them?
I think we have the emir there, and he's not torturing as many people now. Right. So,
and when was he elected? Sir, you know, you got to keep in mind that libertarians take a totally different position with respect to this whole Islamic Muslim thing that conservatives do. I heard all this during the Cold War. I grew up in the Cold War. The communists were coming to get us. There was communists under my bed. When I was a kid, I had to look under my bed to look for a communist. They were all in the State Department. The dominoes were going to fall. 58,000 of my generation were sacrificed in this idiotic war in Southeast Asia, because if we didn't, the dominoes would start falling after this fake and false lying attack at the Gulf of Tonkin. Not one time did conservatives ever talk about the Islamic Muslim threat during the Cold War. And you know why? Because they thought the Cold War was going to last forever. It never occurred to them that the Soviet Union, that had all the guns, was going to get dismantled. And when it did, they had to go looking for a new official enemy, because conservatives had always said the only reason we favor big government, the so-called Department of Defense, which is really the Department of Empire and War, is because of the Cold War. Well, all of a sudden, the Cold War evaporates, and now they got to start looking for a new enemy. So what do? They start going and poking hornets' nests in the Middle East. They intervene in the Persian Gulf War, which was none of their business. They established a regime of sanctions against Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. They got Madeleine Albright saying that the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children are worth it. They've got the unconditional support of the Israeli government. And all of a sudden, they got blowback from that. 9/11, the retaliation, like Ron Paul says, they're over here killing us because we're over there killing them. And what did conservatives say? Oh, Muslims, they attacked Spain in the 1400s. Oh, it's all the Islamic threat. Nonsense. The root of this problem is the U.S. government and its pro-empire policies. This is what conservatives don't want to do. They don't want to confront the wrongdoing of their own government. They want to look everywhere else instead of take personal responsibility.
Yeah, I wonder, as far as, it's interesting, I think it's a mistake to talk of Muslims as a monolith, because you've got some Muslim regimes that are very repressive, and then you've got a place like Turkey. I think the Turks probably have more legal rights than the Russians at this point, and Russia's not a Muslim country. You've got, I think, the people in a lot of the Gulf states around the Persian Gulf, not Iraq or Iran, but in some of the smaller states, they've got more legal rights and more due process than do most of the third world countries around the globe. And I think it's very unfortunate to think, to focus on one religious group as a threat to freedom, because this is the same thing, you know, this is the same mistake the Europeans made in the 1500s and 1600s during the wars of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. This was the crackdowns. There were so many bloodbaths on that, and there are good Muslims and there's bad Muslims. There's good Christians, there's bad Christians. There's probably even good Huguenots and bad Huguenots. But it's important not to throw everybody under the same label and to think that these people are the threat, because it's a hell of a lot more complex.
Anyone else? Yes.
I don't know, just generally. When people, I just wonder, you know, when we complain about the government. Really, the government is just people, and it's people in the government. It's people who support the government. And so, when people say like, "Oh, the government is doing this to me," and the government is doing that to me, the government doesn't exist. It's specific people, and I don't know if it would be helpful to sort of not bring the government as the government. It's just sort of my greedy neighbors or my intolerant neighbors.
But government is the engine, but which some people use to coerce and oppress and plunder other people.
What was the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. It says he was saying that, look, when we talk about government generally, that government is composed of people, and that you know, we've got to keep that in mind. That so how do we really distinguish the principles that we're talking about when we deal with government just that's simply composed of people like we are?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, that's a good point. It's important not to think the government as some, you know, hovercraft floating in the sky, but government, you know, government is the tool that some people use to oppress and extort other people, or to ruin their lives, or to lock them away forever based on offenses which may or may not really be offenses, or do anybody any harm. So I think I've always, in a lot of the writing I've done, I've tried to make people recognize what government is, whether it's the USDA paying farmers not to plant, whether it's the Labor Department paying people to get horrible job training, whether it's people, you know, all kinds of things like that. It's important to have a specific idea of government, and because that's one of the best ways to undermine faith in government.
Well, and I think it's important to keep in mind that we've got two separate entities, government and the private sector. And that recognition is implicit in the Constitution, which protects the private sector, the American people, from the government. And what distinguishes libertarians from conservatives and liberals is that we ask, what should be the role of government in a free society? And we say this is what Americans should be asking today. What should be the role of the federal government and the state government and the local government in a free society, an American society? And that the answer to that question is very different if you ask a libertarian, a conservative, and a liberal. Now, we've only got 4 minutes left, so let me take one last one. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I hear the word government used an awful lot, but I rarely hear anybody ever define the term government. If you don't mind taking a whack at it, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd say government is organized force.
Government is the institution that claims a monopoly of violence, and it claims that to help so it can serve people, but it's a hell of a lot more effective at the violence than it is at the service.
I mean, once you accept, if you believe that government's necessary, and I believe it is, then you have to follow the next step. What should be the role of that government? And that's the whole idea of fundamental rights, that there are certain rights that are beyond the reach of government, beyond the reach of the majority. I mean, that's the whole idea of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, of fundamental rights. It's the purpose of government to protect the exercise of those rights, not to infringe upon them. So anyway, that sort of wraps up our show. I want to thank y'all for coming. I want to thank those of you that are watching this video. You can come to our website at the Future of Freedom Foundation. You can subscribe to our free FFF email update. If you like our work, we depend on voluntary support, donations. We don't accept any government assistance, and we'd love your support. And again, this show is shown every Saturday night live on the internet, and we'd love to have you come and visit it. If not, we put it on our FFF email update the following week. So thank you. It's been fun, and enjoyed the visit with you again this week. And thank you. See you next week. Bye-bye.